So welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we will be continuing our journey through the Daodejing. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. We are currently in chapter 24. So we're going to just go ahead and jump right in here. On tiptoe, no way to stand. Clambering, no way to walk. Self-display, no way to shine. Self-assertion, no way to succeed. Self-praise, no way to flourish. Complacency, no way to endure. So this is the opening setup here. Not that there's a whole lot here that should be terribly surprising. Definitely the Taoists have been making a point along the way that it's not about being ostentatious or trying to stand out or doing things for, public acclaim or praise. So it should be fairly straightforward, the kinds of things we're seeing here. But there's also, at the beginning on tiptoe, right? There's this question of like over trying as well, right? That there's you can be overextended, you can be attempting to hold poses. This clambering is also sometimes translated as straddling. So it's kind of like an awkward way to hold yourself and not a way that you can actually walk, right? So it kind of brings in not just trying to be self-promoting, but also overreaching in some way or another. So it goes through listing a couple of those things. And then he says, according to Tao, excessive food, extraneous activity, inspired disgust. It's kind of a fun line here. Yeah, and wow, such a variety of ways that this passage is translated here, where sometimes they'll talk about rotting food, and there's some really big differences in terms of this extraneous activity, because sometimes it's been like almost talking about like a bloated body because of overeating, but other times it was thought of as like a tumor. Other times it's like excessive activity or excessive something excessive, right? Just a interesting different ways that it's kind of translated. But what I like about what was done here, and this is the Addiss and Lombardo translation, is we can easily understand something like rotten food and tumors as being disgusting, right? But here it's not necessarily as obvious. Excessive food. Well, what does that mean exactly? And is what's excessive to one person excessive to another person? I imagine I probably eat a fair bit more than Taylor does. So she might consider me eating excessively. I don't know. And then the same thing with activity, how much is too much? So they become a little bit, they can kind of go either way, right? It's painting these pictures of these types of activities. And we know from what we've been reading thus far in the Daodejing that these would be activities that are not normally appreciated within that Taoist framework. But if we go back and look at this, going up on tiptoe, maybe we're trying to see over something, maybe we're trying to reach something. We wouldn't necessarily think of this as a bad thing. Again, lots of different ways this clambering or straddling is translated. Some type of contortion that seems like it makes it difficult to walk. But then self-display, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of that that goes on in our culture. Think about like social media, self-assertion. These are things that we would talk about that you need to be able to do, like in business. And here they're saying this is no way to succeed, but in our culture, it definitely would be something needed to succeed. Self-praise. I think a lot of us would be like, yeah, it's not really as authentic when you're praising yourself. But then we also see where this is done quite a bit, and people do kind of like this self-promotion kind of a thing. And complacency. Maybe that one's not one that we would argue with too much. But it's interesting then to think about what's happening here. There is a way of looking at these things that for a Taoist becomes disgusting. Now we're going to pick up on this theme here in just a minute, but I'll just kind of bring this to the last line of the text here. Therefore, the follower of Tao moves on. Just doesn't take any time with these things that other people are chasing after. It's like, yeah, whatever. I don't need that. So before I jump into where I'd like to go with this, I'd like to stop and see if there's any initial observations or thoughts that you've had after going through the text part of it.
Sorry, I had to sneeze. It felt like a little bit of an abrupt ending, but maybe it's just because I don't know where they're going with this quite yet.
Well, if you had to guess based off of, what you've seen thus far, what would you think?
Goes back to everything.
Goes back.
Yeah, it's kind of, yeah.
But sorry to jump in here. It sounds a lot like the movie Seven. And those whole 7 deadly sins and stuff.
Oh, like gluttony.
Yeah. Laziness and pride and
sloth, pride.
Yeah.
Greed.
I don't know if there was. Yeah, I wasn't sure if there was all of them or whatnot, but that was the first thing that came to mind. I was like, yeah, that sounds like 7.
The 7 deadly sins.
I did get gluttony too a little bit about the excessive food thing. The first thing that came to mind was gluttony. But I mean, if you think of a place with like excessive food and a lot of activity, I don't know, a carnival. They hate carnivals in Taoism.
Yeah, I think. Oh, where's that from?
Rob, I think.
That might be Rob. Rob, I muted you because I think you had some noise coming through. Hope that's okay. So, it's definitely a short and sweet little passage here, and maybe one that doesn't feel like it requires a lot of interpretation. I think that we can see some common themes about these ideas not being part of the Taoist strategy. But what I want to kind of focus on then is the, how do I don't want to click here, but I had to for a second. I want to focus on this last line on this slide here about inspired disgust. So this is where I think this is important, is that this isn't an out of the box reaction, right? So just because there happens to be plenty of food, that's not necessarily a disgusting thing. That could be like, oh, great, we're not going to starve or whatever. Same thing with extraneous activity. We might think, man, that's a lot of work, or we might be glad that a lot of work is getting done, but not necessarily disgust. So there's something that then is being cultivated here. And this is also a key strategy for Taoists, is they're cultivating a way of being. And in this case, they're talking about a way of being that perceives these other activities as things that maybe are benign or seen as a positive thing by other people, but in their case, they're working to develop a sense of disgust. Now, the reason for doing so, well, let me just ask you, what would be the benefit of perceiving these things as disgusting? Not just saying that they're disgusting, but actually perceiving them as disgusting.
Just to kind of stay away from the man-made decisions, and just like with the horse, right? Trying to not take not partake in those man-made decisions and feelings and such, just letting go of the motivations for, for who might be like, prideful, who might be gluttoning, and just say, yeah, I'm just gonna eat what I need, not to worry about anything else. We're gonna do what needs to be done, not to worry about anything else.
Mm-hmm. So if we think about, I don't know, imagine something that is enticing to you. Let's say a brownie. I don't know if everybody likes brownies, but I'm just going to say brownie. But you don't want to eat brownies for some reason, right? So you're trying to lose some weight or whatever, and the brownie's sitting there. You have to work hard at not eating it, right? But if it's a moldy brownie, do you have to work hard at not eating it?
No.
No, and I immediately see where this is going.
So if you actually perceive something as actually disgusting, it's not a challenge to not do it because you just don't want to do it. It's not like you would have to be encouraged to, forced to do it, not simply trying to use willpower against it. So this is kind of where I'd like to take this discussion, is to explore this method of self-cultivation in terms of bringing about different types of behaviors or patterns or habits in one's life. And in this case, as it's maybe not specifically thinking about Taoist things, but just in general. So, and there's a couple of different things that we have, and we kind of talked about them in terms of how we can try and address achieving some type of change, right? So it could be that I'm just going to use my willpower to try and stop from eating that brownie or whatever the case may be. Or there's another thing that we might want to explore, and this is the idea of identity. Now, I know that the identifying with the magnifying glass is not quite the same thing as identity, but it's the closest thing I could think of as an image for the idea of identity. But what is the difference here that we're trying to get at in terms of how we look at this? One is this idea of saying, I can't. So when we're using willpower, we're looking at that brownie and we want that brownie, but we're telling ourselves, I can't eat that. And we have to muster up this strength, this willpower to try and stop ourselves from eating it. But if we're looking at it from the position of identity, then we're saying something a little bit different. We're saying, I don't. So this would be like identifying myself as somebody who doesn't eat brownies. Then I'm not saying I can't eat the brownie. I'm saying I don't eat brownies. And this is a whole different kind of like flip of a switch that happens in your brain that's very interesting, because when you say I can't, it's keeping in front of you this idea that you really want to, right? But when you say I don't, you're telling yourself, I'm not the kind of person that does this kind of thing. And it becomes a whole different process. It's kind of like, to take it to more of that extreme, it would be to somehow see that brownie as like moldy, right? Where it just becomes a disgusting thing. And it's not a challenge. It's not a willpower challenge to not eat it. It's become part of who you are at this point, where it's not even an option. It's just not something you would think about doing. you understand a bit about where we're going with this kind of idea of identity
Mm-hmm.
versus willpower?
Yeah, I think there was a chapter like at the very beginning of this
Yes.
that talked a little bit about this.
Yes, I talked about this at actually the first episode, good memory, where we were talking about this kind of distinction. So I'm going to just share a little bit about how I use this for myself, and in terms of using identity to bring about different types of behaviors or changes. So one of the things that anyone can do if they want to try and take advantage of this thing is try to imagine who they want to be, or who would be like the person that they see themselves as, right? Doesn't have to be somebody that you actually are right now, but something that kind of encapsulates a lot of the behaviors and ways of being in the world. That's something that is inspiring to you, or something that you aspire to, and take that in mind. So once you have that image in your mind, then you can start to think about, well, what kinds of things does that kind of person do? And you might actually list some of them out. And this then becomes a source of you reflecting on those things and thinking about it in terms of yourself. And the more you can internalize this identity, it's going to start to shape the different types of behavior, because you won't see certain behaviors as consistent with who you see yourself as. And also you'll see other types of activities as consistent with who you want to be. And it's remarkable how this works, because if you really focus on it, if you really internalize kind of this image, it becomes the I don't versus I can't. And I've got a couple of different examples in my own life I can share with you if you'd like to explore that a little bit further. But I'm just going to share very candidly, what I use for my identity. And you might kind of laugh, I don't know, but we'll just run with it and see what happens. So first off, anybody recognize this guy?
I'm not at my computer. Use your words, Jim. Use your words.
I'll let somebody else guess. Anybody else know who this is? Nobody.
No.
Okay. I guess I'm get to be the old guy in the room. This is from a TV show back in the early 70s. What's that?
David Carradine.
Yes, David Carradine, and a TV show called Kung Fu. And he plays a character called Kane, Kwai Chang Kane, and he's a Shaolin priest that ends up having to go on the run and hides out in America in the early Western days. And it's just a series of adventures that he gets into. And it's interesting because there's frequent mentions of things from Taoism in the show. It's also, if you haven't seen it, you might find it a bit cheesy or corny, because it's definitely dated, and the budget wasn't huge, especially whenever there's any kind of fighting scenes or something. But the message is fascinating. I don't know that I've ever seen a show on TV that delved as deeply into ethical issues and questions about just the moral issues of the day, and more so than this one. It was just a fantastic show. But in any case, this is part of how I see myself, in the sense of, I think about this a monk in this case, not like a Catholic priest or something like that, but in the sense of like what David Carradine was. He had a way of approaching life, and the way he engaged with the problems, that was just inspiring to me. So I use that as kind of my image. And with that, then there is some different things. So I have a page. It's a digital page, but it's on the personal stuff that I reflect on, that I keep track of, like goals and where I'm going with things in my life, but there's also this identity section. And so at the very top of it, it's this idea, I am a monk. And then I have a set of qualities that are kind of identified with that. So one of the things, what is a monk like? Well, a monk is mindful. So this is keeping in mind, okay, if I'm a monk, I'm somebody who is being mindful, not just during like specific meditations, but throughout the day. I'm trying to be always present. A monk has a spiritual and sacred approach to living. So the more I'm kind of reflecting on this on a regular basis and baking this into the way I'm thinking, it has an impact then on how I'm actually living out what I'm doing. A monk cultivates health and well-being. Definitely is something that is a part of how I approach things. And this is another one. A monk does not smoke or drink. Now, this was kind of interesting for me because this isn't exactly true. There are monks out there that definitely smoke and drink, but in my case, I'm saying that a monk doesn't. And so I had not smoked for like, I don't know, probably 10 years or something. And then somehow got caught up in smoking again. And everybody got on me huge about this. They're like, what are you doing? You got to stop this. And, it's kind of funny. I didn't even remember this, but my sister-in-law remembered when I quit that I had said something like, well, once my kids are out of high school or once they're launched or whatever, then I'll start smoking again. And that's actually what happened. And I didn't even remember saying that, but I wonder if, I planted that seed and it just kind of was waiting. And then it was like, okay, now it's all right. But in any case, I finally was like beat over the head enough times. I'm like, okay, I got to do something about this. And this is what I really focused on is I incorporated this line. This line wasn't part of what I had previously for my image of the monk, but I added this in and I was able to literally that day stop smoking. And it's going on 3 years now.
Nice job.
Yeah, but it was there have been times where I've struggled trying to quit stuff in the past, and it was a really difficult process. Now, there's a lot that went into how I was thinking through this process and really incorporating into my head to the point where it could become something that was like disgust, where it didn't become hard for me not to smoke. It was just, I didn't smoke. That's just how it kind of, I don't know how else to explain it really, but it just kind of unfolded that way. And then as a kind of a consequence to that, I realized that all of the arguments that people were making about smoking could also be made about alcohol. And so I just kind of took it as like an experiment and thought, I'm just going to try and stop drinking for a year and see what happens. And I'll give myself, at the end of that year, like a 30-day window where I can drink again, however much I want, and just see if I still like not drinking. And so I did that, and I did the 30 days, and I decided, you know what, I'm fine not drinking. So I decided not to. And that's coming up on 2 years now that's been the case. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I'm not saying that this is what people should be doing. I'm just talking about, in my own personal experience. But using this way of having this identity that I focus on and try to cultivate within myself develops that I don't, or that, and I wouldn't say that I look at smoking as disgusting or drinking as disgusting. It's for me, it's just something that I don't do. But it's the same kind of idea like we're seeing with that Taoist idea. A couple more here. A monk shares insights. So that's part of what I'm doing here. I'm sharing what I learn along my way. A monk is a guardian or a guide through the liminal. Now, this is a little bit more of, how would I put this? almost more like on the coaching side of things, because when we're thinking about liminal space, we're thinking about transitions, we're thinking about transformation from one thing to another thing. And this could be with terms of character, it could be in terms of habits, it could be in terms of identity, or all kinds of different things. There's a place of safety where we move into this liminal space where the ground's maybe kind of pulling out from underneath you and you're a bit unsure about things and you're reformatting things. And then you come out the other side different than you were before. And frequently it's helpful to have somebody with you on that kind of a journey through that space. And part of how I see my role, because of spending as much time as I do in these areas and personal experience, I see that as something then that I can offer to other people if they need it while they're trying to go through and accomplish those kinds of changes in their own life. So that's just part of how I see what I'm doing as well. And then the last one here, there's more to my list. This is just kind of a brief list of some of the key things, is a continuous learner. So this is an important part of how I view myself, as I'm always learning, I'm always studying. And I think that's an important part of what I do. So I'm going to just pause here and come back to the discussion and see what your thoughts are on this, and if this inspired anything for you guys.
I see this type of stuff happen with people. For example, I don't drink vodka, and it's because I was laying out in a cornfield one time when I was a kid because I drank too much vodka. So it's like, I can understand the going from can't to don't as being part of your identity, because like I just don't, I have no interest in that at all. While others could look at it and be like, "Ooh, martini" or whatever. Like it's very much become a part of my identity. To I just no, yuck.
Yeah. Does anybody else attempt to do things with identity for themselves?
I guess I've never intentionally tried to do that, but I also don't drink Jägermeister for a very similar experience. But I, for example, don't drink coffee. And I've always thought myself of, I'm not a coffee drinker. So I've kind of, in a certain ways, because I do find coffee just tasting not pleasantly whatsoever. So I think that's why it was easy for me to, become a person who doesn't drink coffee. But using this intentionally for this exact reason, never done that. I think that's very interesting. I think that definitely I can understand how powerful this could be. And yeah, I might try that, because one of the things that I struggle with is sugar. And I would love to be the person who doesn't eat sweets. But, thinking of becoming this way and doing it's going to be two different things. But I like this idea of this tool you've given me right now, that I can just try to make it part of my identity, which hopefully might make it easier to say no. As I juice the orange juice here right now.
Yeah, I gotta say I agree with that statement. Like I haven't thought about it where I've intentionally tried to do anything, but I have realized I do that as part of like teaching my kids. For example, if one of my kids say like hits their sibling or something like that, I don't go, "No, don't do that, that's bad." I say, "No, we don't do that, that's not how we are." And it's been a technique I've used because it really resonates with them. And like my kids are very polite, they don't hit, they don't do anything bad really. And I think it's part of their identity because of that, like the way I've raise them as like, no, we don't do that
Mm.
as part of our family identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an important point, is it's not always just like an individual identity. It can be more collective as well. You made me think about, like, in many religious contexts, there's a similar idea. So to borrow from some Christian perspectives, there's this idea of discipleship, which as a term means to become disciplined in a particular way of being. And in this case, it's this idea of following after Jesus. And there's other parts that would say things like, let this mind that was in Jesus be in you. And you can see how, even at more of a popular level, they've got this, WWJD, what would Jesus do? And it becomes kind of like this mantra that people would use before making kinds of decisions. But definitely it's taking on the same type of an identity. What kind of person am I? And it even becomes a title, right? A Christian. And that then brings in other dynamics, which can be very helpful in something like this too, because if you have on an individual basis, you're still kind of working with your own self in terms of, how do I incorporate this identity? But when it's part of a larger group, then you've got that collective part of it too, where you're making a proclamation. This is the kind of person I want to be. And the rest of the community is also making that similar proclamation. And then you can work together to help hold each other accountable, or encourage one another in the pursuit of that identity. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Jazz. That's an important part too.
The very moment you said that this is not part of the identity of our family, that's exactly, Jim, what I was thinking. Because the first thing came to mind was, as I watch young children, of how the Christian community, and that immediately reminded me of the documentary I just recently watched about the homeschooling program that the Christian community came up with, and how they used indoctrination of women being submissive and men being in charge, and how this whole identity of a group can be abused for power grabbing and power holding, right? So I think there's also a lesson to be heard here. Identity is great, it's a tool, but it's also a tool that others can misuse for their own benefit, right? So be careful with whose identity you are trying to uphold or maintain.
Yeah, you want to choose your community and choose your role models carefully.
Yeah.
If you haven't used identity as a way to try and adjust behavior, what types of things have you used when you try to change a habit or incorporate a new habit?
I try to make it as easy as possible. So like, if I'm trying to work out in the morning, the night before, I'll like get all the clothes and things that I'm gonna need ready and out. That way I don't have to make any decisions in the morning. I can just get up, everything's already ready to go, and I can just go.
Make it easier. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good technique. Taking it back to the brownie thing, if you're trying not to eat brownies, it's probably a good idea not to have them hanging out in your kitchen.
Yeah. The thing with that, like, I'm trying to also not eat as much sugar, and I have found that getting groceries online and then going to either pick them up or get them delivered helps a lot, because you're not walking through the aisles where all the zebra cakes are.
Yes.
To that, walk through the junk food aisle in the grocery store just to exercise my temptation, or to notice at times my my addiction to sugar has varied at different times. So at times when I'm feeling particularly free from its grasp, I'll walk down the junk food aisle and notice the absence of the compulsion to eat. I'll just kind of be around it without feeling motivated by it, and I just kind of bask in that sensation.
Yeah, that's good.
Must be satisfying. I do use a reminder app because I want to get into a habit of daily cleaning up. Just, as a grown-ass adult, I should be able to maintain a clean house. So I got into a habit of using a reminder app to say, hey, every day at 7 and whatnot, it tells me, hey, do a 10-minute cleanup. And we stop what we're doing and we go and clean up, just to kind of get into the habit. And it became more easier over time, obviously, as we were nagged by the application, go do it. And whenever we don't do it, I go to bed and say, oh, we haven't done that. I kind of make myself, but I do, as what just said, kind of bask into the, you did bad, you need to do better tomorrow. So use the motivation to shame myself a little bit.
Yeah. Does it does the app you're using keep track of the consecutive days that you've done it versus?
Oh no, it's just Google reminders though. But funny you should say that, actually. It reminds me of Simone Gertz, who created that habit calendar. And every day you do the thing you set up today daily, you'll light up a light on the calendar, and to remind you exactly how many days you've done it consecutively, how many days you've skipped, and kind of keep it in front of your eyes. That one habit that you've chosen to follow.
Yeah, I was curious about that because that in particular almost works against me on that one. I know some people like to see like, oh, I've got this long streak and I don't want to break the streak, and that becomes part of the motivation to keep going. But then if something happens and you're just unable to not, to actually complete it, and it breaks that chain, and let's say you had like 6 months or something, and you're like, yes, I'm rocking this thing, and then it's broken and it goes back to zero, that I find like so discouraging. It's actually caused me to like give up on certain things altogether using that particular technique. I imagine it works well for different people, maybe different types of tasks, but that one's hard for me.
It works well as long as you practice non-attachment.
Yeah.
But then it also doesn't work because you're attached to the completion.
Yeah.
Well, I find that exact thing to be a kind of a balancing act, because the point of keeping the streak is to motivate you to take the action. But then if it ends up, if you become so neurotic about it that if you miss a single day, it creates like paralyzing anxiety, it does kind of defeat the purpose. So you have to learn how to both be motivated enough that like you want to do it, but to not fall apart inside if you do break. That's when, if you miss a day, oh, non-attachment, as long as it doesn't do exactly what you said, which is just like create so much anxiety that it repels you from the whole thing. So it's a fun game. There's a gamified habit tracker called Habitica that I've been using for a long time. It's gamified and social. So I have a party on there that we all like chat and keep each other motivated. And one of the things it does is keeps a streak count of your goals for you, and it gives you XP and gold and stuff whenever you do things. It's gamified to make it fun. But
what did you say it was called?
It's called Habitica. The name of
I used that for years. It's really fun.
I found that if like what I eventually did to make it easier for myself is you can make a habit that you're supposed to check off every day, and then it can have subtasks. So I made all my habits with subtasks, and I check my habits off no matter what every day. But I only check off the subtasks if I actually did them. That way, even if I didn't do it, I still keep my streak. And that's what I found. It works for me to not have to worry about keeping my streak. If I do it, I get extra reward. But if I don't do it, no big deal.
Yeah, I think for myself, I'd probably do better if it was like a percentage. Like if it didn't just go back to 0, but I was able to keep it above 90% over the course of the year or something like that. That probably would be a little bit more motivating to me. But the other one that's kind of interesting, and I'll be curious if anybody's played with this trick. There's other apps that you can set up where if you fail on whatever your goal is, it does something like donate a painful amount of money to something that you don't agree with.
Heard of that.
Has anybody tried something like that?
No, that seems too
I've heard of
dangerous.
it, but I haven't tried it.
Yeah, I haven't either. But
I've heard
That's
that
what you call
works.
negative reinforcement.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
heard that's a bad thing.
I've heard that works for certain people, but as far as I can tell, the issue is that you have to be disciplined enough in the first place to actually be able to punish yourself. And if you're disciplined enough in the first place to actually punish yourself, you probably don't need that kind of app.
yeah, well, I think the trick is to take that willpower to punish yourself out of your hands by you contribute the money up front, and the app or an accountability partner or somebody like that is the one that would actually trigger the donation. You don't have to do it yourself. You just kind of
I know, but you have to sign up to you have to like consent.
yeah,
You have to have no willpower to consent to that in the first place.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
I was actually
And be willing to actually be willing to not try to circumvent the consequences, which takes a lot of discipline in the first place. So if you have that much discipline, I think maybe you don't need that.
especially when it comes to money, right?
Yeah.
I was actually the streak reminded me of Duolingo. I'm taking Spanish. I've been taking Spanish for quite a few years now, 2, I think. And they also have a streak. And when I started, I was doing great. It was like 180 days or whatnot, and I broke my shoulder. And a couple of days I was a little bit out, understandably. And I lost my streak, and I was super mad about that. And exactly as you said, I was like, oh, this is so demotivating. I didn't go back to it for a while until other factors kind of reminded me, you should go back into it. And I'm now on day 800, but I am doing the bare minimum to get the streak. Oftentimes I find myself that I can not necessarily circumvent, but I can cheat the system, get the points, get the minimum required points for maintaining that streak quickly. And I'm not actually learning for the past, let's say, 6 months. I found this trick. I'm not actually learning anything. I'm just going through the motions, going through those audio exercises, and half of them the app does for me anyway, and just not necessarily getting the benefit from actually learning Spanish. So there's, I can totally understand what you mean by the
I feel like
motivation.
we're in Habits Anonymous right now.
That's
so
good.
true.
So we're kind of coming to the close of our time. I just wanted to revisit some of the initial stuff that we were talking about in terms of identity, and a little bit about how part of that process also works. So definitely reflection comes into play. It's interesting with the classical level of Taoism, the time frame of when the Daodejing itself was written, how much it doesn't appear that there was a strong practice of like meditation that was happening. That definitely develops later on, especially when it comes into contact with Buddhism, and you have what's called Chan, which is kind of a Taoist interpretation of Buddhism that goes on to export to Japan, that becomes known as Zen Buddhism. But at this stage of the game, there's definitely reflection that's going on. But how, just, my personal take on it is with mindfulness, the way that I would use it, for example, with trying to stop smoking, is I would reflect on the different things that I thought I was smoking for. So one of the ones that for me was an issue is it felt like it was relaxing. It relaxed me. But I have like smart apps and stuff like this that are connected, and I could see what it was actually doing in terms of raising my heart rate and so forth. And so I would actually stop and really think about, is this actually relaxing me? And really work on internalizing the fact it's not actually doing that. Something else is going on. Is it just the taking the time to go outside, or is it the ritual of the behavior, and just really diving deep into what exactly am I experiencing versus what I'm telling myself. And so there's definitely a self-talk part of the things that we get into, stories that we tell ourselves. And so this is where some of that mindfulness or that reflection on what's actually happening versus what am I telling myself. And this really ties in a lot with a lot of the Buddhist, or excuse me, the Taoist movement of trying to, remove those filters, those ways of looking at the world, to try and see more clearly what is. And in doing so, in addition with really reflecting through, well, what does that look like if I'm adopting this persona of monk, and this idea of not smoking and the other characteristics that are important as a monk in terms of health and well-being, and also thinking through things like wanting to be around for my kids and my wife and those kinds of things. All of that works together to kind of develop more of this identity that then ultimately resulted in simply not desiring to smoke, not fighting against it, but just simply not wanting to. And I don't know that this would work the same for everybody or with everything. It definitely has not been quite the same for me when I'm trying to tackle the topic that a lot of you brought up in terms of sugar. There's definitely different approaches I have to take on that one, but they're similar, right? I do take the time to really notice, if I have a cheat day, how do I feel right now? And really try to remember that, so that it becomes part of what I think about when I'm looking at that bread pudding or whatever. That tends to be my downfall, that I have to stay away from. And in thinking through that, the brain fog that comes from too much carbs, the just not feeling good, like not having the right kind of energy. I mean, you get that spike, but then you have the crash, and just the more bloated feeling, at least in the case with the bread pudding. All those things, really taking the time to notice them through that mindfulness becomes very helpful in future decision making. The more you take the time to really notice everything that's going on. So that would be probably another key factor in that identity, is learning to really notice, what do you actually feel versus what you're telling yourself, and then remembering it, like to focus on it long enough to get it into the memory. So I guess that would be part of how we could get back to that idea of the disgust from the text, of starting to have more of that repulsion about certain things. But we've got maybe a couple minutes if there's any final thoughts that anybody else had.
So I would have a question actually about this. How come it turned so sharply? Because from all the other lessons we've had, this was quite a deviation, right? In the tone, in the approach, almost. It's almost. I don't know if Taylor said that you've talked about it in the first lesson, so maybe I'm completely out of the left field, but it feels like this was a really change in everything. In this is how you need to train yourself, because you're a fallible human being, and you need tools, you need some help to not be well. So how do you feel about this change?
So for me, I find that there's kind of a couple of different types of passages in the Daodejing. Some are more about perception, and others are more about cultivation. And so this one I found to be focusing more on the idea of cultivation with this idea of disgust. And so it led to more of a discussion about how do we do that cultivation. There's other passages like chapter 10 that also get into a lot of more of how do we cultivate certain types of behaviors. And I don't know if you recall, but we spent like 4 weeks on that one. So it just kind of depends on the text. If it's getting into the challenge of, like values and how those get imported by culture, that becomes a little bit more of an intellectual kind of process of trying to understand sociologically how these things happen. And other times they're like the nature of reality kind of questions, and sometimes they get more into how do we affect change. So it just kind of depends on where I think the particular passage is leading, the direction that I take.
Maybe I just have, because I haven't been attending every single session, so maybe I was just not paying enough attention to notice that. But that's fair. I hear you.
Yeah, no, it's all good. And yeah, I don't try to lock it down to being just one way, but I definitely tend to lean more on the intellectual side of things, just in general in life. So I definitely am a lot more comfortable there, but sometimes I also like to dive into more of the application side too. All right, guys. Well, we'll bring this to a close. I want to thank you for joining us today. And if you are watching this and you'd like to be a part of the live discussion, you can register your email at www.kinshipcafe.cafe, that is. And we'd love to see you here next time. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Take care.